50,000 lives extinguished in the blink of an eye. The Galactic Council broadcasted their cruelty to the galaxy, but what they didn't expect was the fury that would rise from the unlikeliest of places. Earth, a planet once considered weak and insignificant, would now become the spark that ignited a revolution, demanding justice for the innocent and vengeance against the powerful. The galaxy had watched in stunned silence. Across billions of star systems, the feed from the Galactic Council's central hub blared through every device. For the first time in history, the once unquestionable leaders of the galaxy had chosen to make their most brutal decision public. A cold, emotionless voice echoed over the broadcast. The execution of 50,000 rebels is now commencing. The visuals were gruesome. 50,000 men, women, and children shackled and kneeling before the deadly gaze of the Council's merciless enforcers. I could feel my chest tighten, my heart pounding in my ears. The screen displayed the faces of the condemned. Some were young, barely more than children, their eyes wide with fear. Others were older, their expressions a mixture of defiance and despair. They had dared to rise against the Council, and for that, they would pay with their lives. I wanted to look away, to block out the horrific scene unfolding in front of me, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. This wasn't just a broadcast. It was a message from the Galactic Council, broadcast to every corner of the galaxy, meant to instill fear into every soul that dared to challenge their reign. The galaxy held its breath as the countdown began. The last seconds of 50,000 lives ticking away. Second by second, the silence was deafening. The weight of what was happening seemed to crush everything in its path. The Council's enforcers stood stoic, unmoving, their weapons aimed at the prisoners. The air around them crackled with tension. My hands trembled, but I wasn't sure if it was from anger or fear. My mind raced. How could this happen? How could anyone, no matter how powerful, treat human lives, any lives, with such blatant disregard? These were no mere criminals. These were people. Fathers, mothers, children, rebels fighting for what they believed in. They were no different from us, from the people on Earth, from the millions who watched in horror. The Council's cold indifference was suffocating. Then, the unthinkable happened. The shot rang out. One by one, the condemned fell, their bodies crumpling to the ground, lifeless, their blood staining the earth beneath them. The feed didn't cut away. It didn't blur or censor the gruesome reality. It played out in its entirety for all to see. The screams echoed in my ears, a haunting reminder of the merciless power of the Council. They had killed 50,000 people, and they were showing the galaxy just how far they were willing to go to maintain control. I could hear the murmurs rising from every corner of Earth. A low rumble at first, a ripple of disbelief. The broadcast had just begun, but I could feel something shifting, something stirring within me, within all of us. Fear, yes, but also something stronger. Rage. For the first time in my life, I understood the power of unity, of standing together for something greater than ourselves. It wasn't just an attack on 50,000 innocent lives. It was an attack on everything humanity stood for. It was an attack on justice. It was an attack on us. As the last body fell, the cold voice of the Council returned. This is a lesson to all. The power of the Galactic Council is absolute. This is the fate of all who defy us. But as their words faded into the background, a new sound began to rise, a sound that had been absent from the galaxy for far too long. The sound of humanity, united and ready to fight back. The message was clear. The Galactic Council had made a grave mistake, and they would soon learn that the fire they had sparked would not be extinguished easily. Earth was silent for a moment, as though the entire planet held its breath. The screen in every home, every office, every public space flashed with images of the slaughter. The scene was still fresh, burned into the minds of billions. But that silence didn't last long. It couldn't. A ripple, no, a tidal wave of outrage flooded the global networks. It started in small pockets, whispers in the streets, hushed conversations between strangers. But it grew, faster and louder until it was everywhere. Voices rose in a cacophony of anger and disbelief. How could they do this? How could anyone? The weight of the injustice, of the cold, calculated slaughter was unbearable. 50,000 lives, gone, without a second thought, without mercy. People took to the streets. Protesters gathered in massive crowds, holding signs, chanting, demanding justice. The world was waking up. The world was angry. Across every continent, from the smallest villages to the busiest cities, Earth was united in its fury. There were no more borders between nations. There were no more divisions between us. We were no longer a planet of scattered voices and divided opinions. We were one, connected by the undeniable truth of what had just happened. The global news outlets flooded with reports. Every corner of the world felt the impact of the broadcast, the raw emotion of the moment seeping through every news anchor's voice. People who had never cared about politics, about power, about distant intergalactic conflicts, now found themselves drawn into this fight. It wasn't just the politicians who were speaking out anymore. It wasn't just the leaders of countries. It was everyone. Teachers, doctors, factory workers, farmers, scientists, ordinary people who had no previous reason to think about the galaxy, now shouting for justice. People were angry. People were terrified. But above all, people were demanding accountability. The United Earth Council, which had often been seen as weak, fragmented, and ineffective, now stood united as one. The leaders of every nation, every continent, put aside their differences, their disagreements, their political squabbles. It was no longer about what divided us. It was about what united us. The undeniable truth that Earth would not be a victim, that Earth would not allow such an atrocity to go unanswered, and Earth would never again stand by, silent, while the powerful crushed the powerless underfoot. We will not stand by. The President of the United Earth Council declared in a public address. Her voice was steady, but the fury behind her words was unmistakable. The Galactic Council has committed an unspeakable atrocity, and we will not rest until justice is served. The streets of every major city were filled with protesters demanding action. It didn't matter what their previous politics had been. It didn't matter whether they had ever even heard of the Galactic Council before that broadcast. The rage had infected us all, and there was no escaping it. The cries for justice echoed from every corner of the world. This was not right. This was not just. The words were everywhere, on the lips of every man, woman, and child. No more. The Galactic Council, they thought they could crush a rebellion, send a message of fear across the galaxy, and Earth would cower. But they had miscalculated. They had underestimated us. They had made a mistake. Because Earth wasn't just a planet of resources, a speck in the vastness of space. Earth was something more. Humanity was something more. We were not a world that could be silenced, not a people that could be ignored. The fire that had been kindled on Earth was burning brighter, growing stronger with every passing second, and the Council had no idea what they had just set in motion. Across Earth, every voice, no matter how small, now had a place in this fight. It wasn't just about one person, one country, one group. It was about all of us, united against the injustice that threatened to define our future. The war for justice had begun, and this time, the Galactic Council would not silence us. As the days passed, the shock of what had happened began to settle into a deep, aching rage. The broadcast from the Galactic Council continued, but they felt distant now, irrelevant to the growing storm on Earth. The world was changing. The voices that had once been isolated in their anger were now linked together in one unified demand: accountability. And the people of Earth were relentless. every day, more protests, more marches, more calls for justice. It wasn't just the media anymore. It wasn't just the politicians. It was everyone. The workers in the factories, the students in the classrooms, the families sitting around their dinner tables. All of them had felt the same sense of outrage, the same need for something to be done. They didn't care who the Galactic Council was. They didn't care what laws they had passed, what systems they had put in place, what rules they had enforced. All they knew was that 50,000 lives had been taken, and someone had to answer for that. The United Earth Council called for immediate action. A summit was held, leaders from every nation coming together, every voice rising in harmony. It was an unprecedented moment of unity. Earth had always been divided, fractured by borders, by beliefs, by ideologies. But now, none of that mattered. What mattered was the truth. The Council had killed 50,000 innocent people, and Earth would not rest until justice was served. The President's voice rang out over every broadcast channel, her words strong, unwavering. We will not let this pass. We demand justice. We demand accountability from those who believe they are above it all. The Galactic Council must answer for the lives they have taken. There was a collective roar from the streets, from every corner of the globe. People demanded action. They demanded not just words, not just promises, but consequences. In every city, massive demonstrations erupted. People filled the streets, waving banners, chanting, their voices raised as one, united against the injustice. The cries were deafening, the sound of millions standing together, demanding that something be done. But as the days wore on, it became clear that the Galactic Council didn't care. They dismissed us. They belittled us. This is a matter for the galaxy's elite, their spokespeople said. Earth will fall in line. It always has. They thought they could dismiss us, treat us like nothing more than a nuisance. They thought they could silence us with their power, their technology, their fleets. But they had forgotten something important. They had underestimated us. They had underestimated Earth. Because we weren't afraid. Not anymore. We weren't some distant, weak planet that could be ignored. We had something they didn't. We had unity, and with that unity came strength. Humanity wasn't just angry now. We were emboldened, ready to do whatever it took to make sure that this never happened again. Earth wasn't just reacting to the murder of 50,000 people. Earth was sending a message to the Galactic Council and to anyone else who thought they could trample over us. A message that would be heard across the stars. We are not afraid. The demand for accountability grew louder, stronger, more insistent. From the youngest child to the oldest elder, from the factory worker to the scientist, from the farmer to the soldier, everyone was speaking up, standing up, fighting back. The Council's dismissal of Earth's demands only fueled our resolve. They couldn't silence us. They couldn't stop us. The truth was on our side, and it was powerful. It was unstoppable. As we marched forward, it was clear that Earth was no longer the helpless, insignificant planet it had once been. We had become something more. We had become a force to be reckoned with. And the Galactic Council, for all its power, had just made a grave mistake. They had underestimated the will of humanity. They had forgotten that when people stand together, there is nothing that can stop them. The Galactic Council at first acted dismissively. They had always been the ones in control, the ones who set the rules and enforced them with an iron fist. The rebellion of Earth, though unexpected, was nothing more than a brief disturbance in their eyes, a temporary inconvenience, a tiny spark that would be snuffed out in time. This is not your concern, their spokespeople declared with cold indifference. Earth will fall in line, like every other world before it. They spoke as if they were invincible, as if the sheer might of their empire would crush any resistance. They believed that Earth would bow to their authority, that our anger would subside, our protests would fade. and we would return to being the quiet, compliant planet they had always known. But they were wrong. The more they dismissed us, the louder we became. The more they ignored us, the stronger we grew. Earth was no longer the passive, isolated planet they thought it was. The broadcasts from the Council, their attempts to silence our demand for justice, only served to fuel the fire within us. Every dismissal, every condescending statement from their representatives only pushed us further. They had underestimated something they had never accounted for: the resilience of humanity. It wasn't just the president of the United Earth Council speaking out anymore. It was the voices of ordinary people. People who had never even cared about politics before. People who had never even heard of the Galactic Council, now standing up and demanding justice. The voice of Earth had become a chorus that could not be silenced. Every day, new protests sprang up across the planet, larger than the last. Demonstrations turned into strikes. Strikes turned into organized resistance. And soon it was clear that Earth wasn't just calling for justice. We were preparing for something far bigger. The Galactic Council, in their arrogance, failed to understand one simple truth. We weren't afraid. They sent fleets, massive warships, and military forces into Earth's orbit, hoping to intimidate us into submission. They thought their ships, their weapons, their technology could break us. But they had forgotten one thing: the power of unity, the power of a people who had nothing left to lose. Earth had no fleet, no advanced military, no grand ships of war. But what we had was something far more dangerous. We had each other, and that was more than enough. As their fleets loomed in the distance, Earth responded with something unexpected. Instead of cowering in fear, instead of running and hiding, we turned our rage into action. We didn't need advanced weapons or ships. We had ingenuity, resourcefulness, and the courage to stand up against impossible odds. Underground movements sprang up across the planet, their numbers swelling each day. The people who had once been complacent now banded together, forming alliances, organizing, preparing for what was to come. In the heart of every city, every town, a quiet rebellion began to take shape. We didn't need to fight them directly yet. We needed to show them that Earth was no longer the passive, complacent planet they thought they could control. We would make it clear to the Council that their threats, their ships, their power, none of it mattered. Because in the end, we had something they could never take away: the will to fight. And as Earth stood united, defiant against the seemingly unstoppable force of the Galactic Council, the universe began to take notice. The Council's grip on the galaxy was not as unshakable as they had believed. The more they tightened their hold, the more the people of Earth dug in their heels, ready to rise up against the tyranny. The Council had miscalculated, and Earth was about to show them just how wrong they were. The fire had been lit, and nothing could extinguish it now. As the days passed, the world began to change in ways that were unimaginable just weeks earlier. The Galactic Council, in their overwhelming arrogance, had thought they could crush Earth under their boot, that they could silence us with their military might. But what they didn't understand, what they could never comprehend, was the sheer power of a people who had been pushed too far. Earth wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. We were fighting for our very survival, for the right to exist without fear, without oppression. The protests hadn't stopped. They'd only grown, blossomed into something far more powerful than anyone, even on Earth, could have predicted. Every corner of every city was filled with the sound of people standing together, demanding that the bloodshed stop, demanding that the Council answer for their crimes. The streets of the major cities were still a sea of angry, defiant faces. But now, there was something new: hope. It was a quiet thing at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew with each passing day. People who had once lived in fear of retribution from the Council were now rising up, unafraid to speak out, unafraid to demand what was rightfully theirs: justice. They weren't alone. The resistance had grown from an isolated few into a network of millions. Ordinary citizens, men and women from all walks of life, had taken up the cause, not because they had been asked to, but because they had to. They had no choice but to stand up. They had seen the truth of what the Galactic Council was capable of, and they couldn't go back to the complacency they had known before. Behind closed doors, in the dark corners of the underground, plans were being made. The resistance had begun to organize itself, quietly, methodically. People who had once been scattered, divided by distance, by politics, were now united under one cause: to dismantle the hold of the Galactic Council. They weren't naive. They knew it wouldn't be easy. They knew the Council had resources, armies, fleets. But what they had failed to realize was the power of the people who had no other choice but to fight back. And the more the Council responded with threats, with military force, the more Earth resisted. Earth didn't just bend to their will. It didn't cower in fear. Instead, it grew stronger. Every time they sent a warship to intimidate us, it only fueled the fire that burned inside of us. Every attempt to break our spirit only made our resolve harder, unbreakable. They could not defeat us, not through force, not through fear. We had something they could never take away: the belief that we were right, that what we were doing wasn't just for Earth, but for every world that had been oppressed by their tyranny. The Galactic Council had underestimated us, but now they could see the consequences of their actions. The resistance wasn't just a group of rebels anymore. It had become a movement. It had become a call to arms that was echoing across the galaxy. There were whispers of other planets, of other systems, that were watching what was happening on Earth and starting to question the authority of the Council. It wasn't just about 50,000 lives anymore. It was about something far larger: freedom. It was about the right to exist without the constant shadow of fear, without the iron grip of the Council dictating every decision, every moment. And as Earth's resistance grew stronger, the Council began to realize something they hadn't prepared for. They were no longer in control. The people of Earth had ignited something they couldn't extinguish, and that was a fire that would spread across the galaxy, one star system at a time. The Galactic Council's response was swift, brutal, and exactly what we had come to expect. They had miscalculated, underestimated the strength of a united Earth, and now they were desperate to regain control. Their fleets, massive and terrifying, loomed ever closer to Earth's atmosphere, their warships cutting through space like shadows, prepared to crush any resistance that dared stand in their way. They had assumed that the show of force, the display of overwhelming military power, would be enough to break us. But they didn't understand. They didn't understand that we were no longer afraid. The power of fear, which had once kept us compliant, was gone. The people of Earth had awakened, and now we were something far more dangerous to them than they had ever imagined. The streets, once filled with protests and chants, had taken on a different energy. The air was thick with anticipation, with the knowledge that something larger was at play now. The resistance had begun to organize in earnest, recruiting from every corner of the planet. Ordinary citizens, once indifferent to the plight of others, now took up arms in a fight they hadn't chosen, but had no choice but to be a part of. The Council's fleets would soon arrive, but Earth was ready. We had no choice but to be ready. It wasn't just military might we had to rely on. The resistance had become something more than a ragtag group of rebels. It was a network, an intricate web of alliances between countries, between factions, all driven by a common cause. It wasn't about national borders anymore. It wasn't about individual power. It was about us. All of us, united in the belief that Earth had the right to stand on its own, without fear, without the crushing weight of the Council's will. It was about the right to be free, to be human, to live without oppression. As the Council's ships entered Earth's orbit, the planet held its breath. The tension was palpable. We knew what was at stake, but we also knew this wasn't just Earth's fight anymore. This was a fight for every oppressed world, for every system that had been crushed under the heel of the Galactic Council's empire. The Resistance had spread its message, its call for action, far beyond Earth. Planets across the galaxy began to listen. The whispers of rebellion were no longer silent, no longer confined to the edges of space. They were spreading, gaining momentum. The world watched as Earth's resistance made its first move. The fleets of the Galactic Council, massive and imposing as they were, found themselves unprepared for what was to come. Earth, with its ingenuity, its courage, and its unity, had become something they could no longer control. The first wave of Earth's fighters, a collection of renegade ships and armed civilians, engaged the Council's ships with a ferocity that shocked even the most hardened military commanders. We were outgunned, outnumbered, but we had something far more powerful: the will to fight. The battle in space was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. Ships clashed in a dazzling display of fire and fury, the stars themselves seeming to explode with the impact of weapons and force. The Galactic Council's fleets, for all their might, were no match for the coordinated, relentless attack that Earth's resistance had launched. It was chaos, but it was chaos with purpose. Earth fought not just for survival, but for something greater: justice. On the ground, the fight continued. As Earth's forces battled in space, the people of Earth fought for control of the cities, the streets, reclaiming them from the Council's enforcers. The world was in the grip of war, but it was a war of our own making. A war we had chosen because we had no choice. The lives of 50,000 innocents had been taken, but it was more than just that now. It was the fight for the soul of humanity. It was the fight for our future, and we would not back down. As the Galactic Council's ships fell from the sky, one after another, the message became clear. Earth had not only fought back, it had won. The Council was not invincible. They were vulnerable, just like the rest of us. And for the first time in history, the galaxy understood something that had always been true. No one was beyond accountability, not even the mighty Galactic Council. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. The remnants of the Galactic Council's once mighty fleets floated in space, their shattered remains a testament to the power of Earth's resistance. The skies above Earth were no longer clouded by the looming threat of their warships. For the first time in weeks, the world could breathe again, though it was a breath filled with exhaustion and relief. The price of our victory had been high. Lives had been lost. Cities had been torn apart. The wounds would take time to heal, but the message had been sent. Earth had not only stood up against the Council, we had defeated them. In the days following the battle, Earth's resistance turned its focus from survival to rebuilding. But the struggle was far from over. The Galactic Council may have been defeated, but the remnants of their empire were still scattered throughout the galaxy. The question now was not whether we had won, but what came next. Earth had proven that it could stand on its own, that it was not afraid to fight for what was right. But now, we had to ensure that the mistakes of the past were never repeated. We had to make sure that the galaxy, in its fragile unity, could never again fall into the hands of those who sought to control, to dominate, to oppress. Leaders from all over Earth gathered in the United Nations Assembly Hall, now transformed into the headquarters of a new, united Earth government. They didn't just speak of the past, of the horrors we had endured. They spoke of the future, a future where Earth was no longer isolated, no longer afraid of the power of the Galactic Council. A future where the rest of the galaxy could see us as we were, not as pawns, not as weaklings, but as equals. The President of Earth stood before the assembly, her eyes scanning the crowd, her voice steady, but filled with the weight of what had transpired. We have shown the galaxy that we are not a people to be ignored, not a world to be conquered, she said. The Council's arrogance has cost them everything, but it will not stop here. We have a responsibility now, not just to ourselves, but to the rest of the galaxy. We will ensure that no world, no people, ever have to face the tyranny we faced again. We will rebuild, and we will be stronger than before. The world was united now. The scars of war were still visible, but they were healing. New alliances were formed, new treaties signed. The Galactic Council's downfall had shown the galaxy something it had never fully understood before. Earth was not to be underestimated. But there was another side to the aftermath. The remnants of the Galactic Council, though scattered and fractured, were not easily forgotten. Their reach was long, their influence far-reaching. But Earth had something they didn't: resolve. We had been brought to the brink of destruction, yet we had risen from the ashes, stronger, more determined than ever. As the news of the Council's defeat spread throughout the galaxy, whispers began to spread too. Other worlds, oppressed under the same system, began to rise up, inspired by Earth's bravery. The Council's grip on the galaxy was loosening, one system at a time. But Earth would not be the only world to fight for freedom. The entire galaxy was waking up. And as Earth stood at the center of this newfound rebellion, we understood something deeply important. The battle for justice, for freedom, was not just about defeating an empire. It was about ensuring that everyone had the right to stand up, to fight, and to speak. Earth had fought for its own future, yes, but we had also fought for the future of the galaxy. No longer would worlds be silenced by the weight of oppression. No longer would they live in fear of those who thought they were invincible. Earth had shown the galaxy that no one, no matter how powerful, could ever silence the cry for justice. The fight was over, but the victory had only just begun. And now, as Earth turned its gaze toward the stars, there was one final message we would send to the galaxy, one that would echo for generations to come. We were no longer a divided world, no longer a place of quiet desperation. We were Earth. We were united, and we would not be stopped. Thank you for listening this story. If you enjoyed it, please consider supporting my channel and subscribing. Your support means the world to me, and I promise to keep working hard to bring you more content you'll love. Together, we can make a difference, one story at a time.